Hi there and welcome to this video. I'm just back from a recent trip to Lisbon in Portugal. I've been before and I wanted to go back. I really like Lisbon. It's a city that's got quite a lot of character, a lot of history. The architecture is quite interesting. Obviously the food and the wine is really good. And it's quite quirky and individual by nature. The geography helps that because it is quite hilly, but it's on the coast and you can get out by public transport quite easily to places like Estoril and Cascais, which have their own individual characters. Because it's hilly, you can get some really good vantage points for sunsets and sunrises, and it's got some quite quirky public transport in terms of some historic trams that they still keep because of the narrow and winding nature of the streets. So it's a really attractive place to travel to, particularly if you're into photography and video. Equally, the weather is quite good year round. It's only 2.5 to 3 hours from London, which is great for me. And the airport in Lisbon is only 15 to 20 minutes by taxi into the centre. So you don't spend a lot of time transiting from the airport into the centre. So it's fairly easy and fairly attractive to get to from the UK. So in my trip to Lisbon, I was there for about 4 days and it was a pretty packed agenda. As with so many of my trips, actually photography wasn't the primary reason I was there, and therefore I was in a lot of meetings. However, what I knew was I was going to have a little bit of time, and I thought initially that I was going to record some videos for the channel while I was there because that's fairly easy for me to do. However, when I look back over 2019, I've done a lot more video in 2019 compared to photography, and in 2020 I want to try and redress that balance a little bit. So when I looked at the daylight times in Lisbon, I realised that actually in January, sunrise is about 8 o'clock in the morning and sunset is about 5 in the evening. So I realised that if I went out about 7 o'clock in the morning before the sun came up and came back at about 8:15, that would give me an hour, just over an hour, to really use the time before sunrise as a bit of a scouting trip for a future trip back to Lisbon. Now, when we look at brochure photographs, guidebook photographs, Instagram photographs, they all give a slightly false impression in many ways. To get the photos, they're going to be the best photos at the right time of year, at the right time of day, with the right weather conditions. So to get that collection of photos, you've got to be there at least a minimum of a year and living in a city. And therefore, if you're only going for a shorter period of time, or perhaps you're going to go there a couple of times, planning is really important, and also managing your expectations. And therefore for me, if I know I'm going somewhere, planning starts as early as I can, perhaps before I've even booked the trip and I'm really thinking about it. I'll either use OneNote or a series of folders or galleries to start capturing images and ideas and maps and things that I could be doing when I'm there. So I've got a series of different OneNote books on the go at any one time, just capturing ideas for future trips. But once you've booked, you can really up the game and up your planning, whether you've got months before you go or only a few days. So my planning tends to start with desk research, and I will go back quite traditional. I'll buy a guidebook quite often because some of the photos in there will give you ideas of the key areas, the key ideas. The one thing with guidebooks though is they tend to be quite mainstream. They will have those hero shots in there. They will have the main a focus on the main attractions, and so often I've found that when you actually go to a place, actually it's not the main attractions that get you the best photographs. It can be the secondary attractions or the side streets off from the main attractions. So whilst the guidebooks are a great starting point, they aren't the only source of inspiration that I use. In the modern internet connected world that we live in, there are so many other sources of inspiration. If you're looking for still images, then you've got Instagram, 500px, Flickr. If you're looking at video, you've got YouTube. And all of them are quite easily searchable and a great opportunities to find the kind of shots and the inspirations that really fit with what you're looking to do when you're in a location. For me, these are sources of inspiration. They don't often give me the exact shots that I'm looking for, because quite often if you get to that level of trying to replicate a shot, you'll be disappointed, because when you go there it'll be a different lighting condition, the amount of people and traffic will be different. So quite often I will use it as inspiration for a style. It gives you a feel for the place, it gives you an idea that you can then take into your own type of image. Equally, one thing that can be really useful if you've got a bit of time is reaching out to various forums and asking locals where the best places are to shoot from, because what you find is with Instagram and 500px and Flickr, over time I've seen it become more competitive, whereas in the past people would share the location details of where they'd taken the shot. Increasingly people are less willing to do that, and therefore you have to be a bit of a detective to find where some of these locations are. And in order to find a location, you're going to have to look for the type of buildings, the size of buildings. Are there any distinguishing features? If you're lucky, there might be a street name in the photo which will help you. But this is where, if you can work out the lay of the land from the photo, you can then use Google Maps to try and help you identify where that photo may have been taken. So when you go into Google Maps, some of the lesser used functionality can be quite useful. So looking at the terrain map rather than just the flat road map, using Street View is really useful. And I find Google Maps really useful because when you do find a location, you can star that location and it will synchronize with your smartphone, so when you're actually in the location you can work out your route to that place quite easily. So you have to be a bit of a detective, and that can take some time. It can be quite rewarding when you do find where some of these shots are, and what you find is when you get there, actually the camera does lie sometimes, and what the image you get you would never have found just from standing there. A bit closer to the time, I tend to look at the weather, the sunrise and sunsets, the daylight times, and this is where there's a few apps I use that come in and become quite useful. So for the daylight and where the sun is going to rise from, or the moon, and where it's going to set, I use an app called the Photographer's Ephemeris, and you can either download it as an app or you can use it as a desktop version. And this is great, as I say, for dialing in the exact dates you're going to be there and seeing where the sun is going to rise at what time. There is a parallel app that goes with it called Photo Transit, and that is great for working out what lens choice you're going to have and which lenses you should put in your kit bag. So let's take a quick look at both of those apps. So let's take a look at these two apps. The first one was the Photographer's Ephemeris, TPE. Now there's a lot of functionality in both these apps, so I'm going to do a more full review at some point in the future. So this is really just a very quick insight as to what you can achieve with this. So the Photographer's Ephemeris, I've got a pin here dropped exactly where I was going to be I was planning to be for the sunrise in Lisbon, and you can see I've set it to the terrain map. You can have different map forms, and you can set a date. That's today's date, and you can set it to any date in the future, so when you know when you're going to be there. And what this shows you is where the yellow line is where the sun is going to rise. That's at 7:42 this morning, the sun rose there, and the orange line is where the sun's going to set this evening at 17:59. It also shows you where the moon is going to rise and fall, so quite a lot of really useful planning information here about the lighting and the sunrise and sunset. So I could see here I was going to be on an east facing hill looking towards the castle, and the sun was going to come up over the hill on the opposite side. So let's take a quick look at the photo that actually came out and just see how accurate this is as an app. So the next app I said was Photo Transit. This is slightly different. This is really useful for helping you work out what lenses you might need to take with you. Again, I've got a pin dropped here for where I was in Greece over the summer when I was looking to capture the full moon rising over the Temple of Poseidon. And what you can do is you can set it to the type of sensor you've got, whether it's APS-C or full frame, and you can set whichever lens you're going to be thinking about. In there I've got my 24-70 dialed in at the moment, and what you can see on the screen is the at different focal lengths what's going to be in shot, and you can move the focal length to say actually I'm going to want 50mm. I can see what's going to be in frame versus 24 versus 70. If I dial in my 70 to 200, as you can see at 200 you've got a very narrow field of view versus 70. So it's really good to get a feel for what each lens is likely to capture in different scenarios. Again, there's a lot more functionality in this app, and we'll go into that perhaps in a future video. So how did this all work out? Well, it worked out pretty well for me. I managed to get out of the hotel at about 7 o'clock on a couple of mornings and have an hour or so out in that hour just before the sun rose and just a little bit of time after the sun rose on one morning. And the advantage of early morning is there's obviously less traffic and less people around, which is great. But because I was in a time constrained slot, I knew I was only going to get one chance of the sunrise. And with the trams, because at that time in the morning they only come round around once every 10 or 15 minutes, I was probably only going to get the chance of one shot at each of the locations. But that's where managing your expectations can be quite useful, and I saw this trip as part of my planning for a future trip, and therefore as a scouting trip I wasn't looking for perfection in terms of the composition, the lighting, etc. in the shots. It had a purpose, which was scouting, not perfection. So I was managing my expectations. And it is important to, as a photographer or a videographer, to manage your expectations. Many of us are striving for perfection, but actually we're the only ones who can see that perfection quite often. And the shots I got, I was pretty pleased with. And if you didn't know I was under time pressure, you may not even realise. So what I'm going to do is in a future video, I'm going to go through the shots that I captured, the locations, and give you a few thoughts on that. But if you've enjoyed this video, perhaps you've been to Lisbon. If you have, let me know in the comments below where you found some great locations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and let's finish on a few of the shots I captured in Lisbon.